The tattoo on his neck moved when he lied. I had memoized that fact the way a woman memoizes every dangerous thing about the man she loves, quietly, privately, filing it away in a place she prays she'll never need to open. The dragon coiled up Hyun's neck would ripple, almost breathe, whenever the truth became inconvenient for him. I used to think it was beautiful. Standing here now, pressing my back against the cold mahogany of this door, my hand crushed over my mouth to trap the scream trying to claw its way out of my chest, I realize I was never watching a tattoo. I was watching a warning I was too in love to read. 3 hours ago, I was the most envied woman in Seoul. That is not arrogance. That is simply the arithmetic of my life. The penthouse on the 62nd floor of the Seoj Tower. The closets that looked like museum exhibitions. The car that arrived before I even reached the lobby. The husband, God, the husband, who could silence an entire boardroom by straightening his cufflinks, yet would spend 20 quiet minutes on a Sunday morning rebraiding the section of my hair I could never quite reach myself. Kwon Hyun. My anchor. My architecture. The man I had built every version of my future self around. I had married him believing I was choosing safety. My father had approved of him. My father, the most suspicious man to ever draw breath, had looked Hyun in the eye and nodded. That nod was currency I spent freely for 3 years. That nod was the reason I unpacked my bags and stopped looking for the exits. That nod, I now understand, was the last thing my father ever gave me before Hyun took everything else. Tonight was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. I was dressed for it, navy lace, my braids swept over one shoulder, heels that cost more than my first apartment. I had come down the hallway to call him to the table, moving on quiet feet across marble floors the color of ash. And then I heard his voice through the gap in the study door. Not the voice he used with me, low, deliberate, almost tender in its control. This voice was different. Stripped of every layer of the man I married. What lived underneath was something I had no name for yet. She found nothing, he said. And even if she had, her father made sure she'd never know who to trust with it. I made sure of that personally. The hallway tilted. My hand found the wall before my legs could forget their purpose. I did not move. I did not breathe. I became the most still thing in that penthouse, stiller than the art on the walls, stiller than the city suspended 62 floors below us, stiller than the version of myself that had existed 4 seconds ago and would never exist again. Through the crack in the door, I could see him, back turned, phone pressed to his ear, one hand in his pocket like a man discussing the weather. The charcoal suit. The military sharp fade. And that tattoo, that dragon, coiling and breathing with every word that dismantled my world. He thought I had already left for the restaurant. He thought he was completely alone. He had no idea that the woman he had lied to for 3 years was standing close enough to hear his pulse, and that she was no longer crying. She was counting. The dinner got cold on the table that night. But what Hyun Kwon lit in me? That has been burning ever since. 3 hours ago, I was the most envied woman in New York. The penthouse on the 58th floor of the Kwonseo Tower on 5th Avenue had a view that made other people's lives look like thumbnails. Floor-to-ceiling glass. A kitchen that had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. Closets that were organized by season, by color, by the quiet, invisible labor of a woman who understood that in Hyun's world, appearances were armor. I had worn that armor well. Kwon Hyun was not the kind of man you described in simple terms. He was the kind of man you felt before he entered a room, a shift in atmospheric pressure, a collective straightening of spines. In boardrooms, he was surgical. At charity galas, he was magnetic. And at home, in the rare, unguarded hours between midnight and dawn, he was something I had convinced myself was real, warm, deliberate, and entirely mine. I am Amelia. I have my mother's patience and my father's eyes, and for 3 years I used both to build a life inside the golden architecture of Hyun's world. My braids, always long and intricate, took hours to maintain, a ritual Hyun had once called meditative. He would sit across from me while I worked a new section and say nothing, just watch, and in those silences I had filed away everything I believed our marriage was. Trust. Safety. Home. My father, Reginald Osei, a retired foreign diplomat with an instinct for deception that bordered on supernatural, had approved of Hyun. That approval had cost me my skepticism. A man like my father did not nod at just anyone. So I had unpacked my bags, hung my dresses in the color-coded closet, and stopped looking for exits. That was my first mistake. The argument I started on a Tuesday was not an accident. I had been watching Hyun for weeks by then, small things, threads that didn't belong in the fabric of our marriage. A second phone that appeared and vanished. Conversations that died the moment I entered a room. The way his eyes would slide past me sometimes, not with coldness, but with something more unsettling, calculation. So I gave him a stage and put on a performance. I chose a night when his lieutenants were downstairs, when sound traveled. I stood in the center of our bedroom in the white silk robe he had bought me in Tokyo, and I told him, with every ounce of the precision my father had raised me to wield, that I was done. I'm leaving, Hyun. My voice was flat. Practiced. This marriage has been a performance for 2 years and I am exhausted from playing my role. I watched his face. This was the test. A man who loves you breaks. A man who owns you recalculates. Hyun set down his glass slowly. The dragon on his neck was still. His eyes found mine with an expression I catalogued and stored immediately, not grief, not panic. Something measured. Something that decided. You're emotional, he said. Sleep. We'll talk in the morning. Not, please don't go. Not, I love you. We'll talk in the morning, the language of a man managing an asset. I cried loudly enough for the men downstairs to hear, then I packed one bag with theater and left it by the door. By morning, I had unpacked it in silence and returned every item to its place. Hyun never checked. He had already moved on to whatever came next in his mind, whatever my stage departure had unlocked in his schedule. That told me everything I needed to know, and nothing as devastating as what came 3 nights later. I came down the hallway to call him to dinner. Anniversary dinner. Navy lace dress. Braids over one shoulder. The table set with the Japanese candles he preferred. I was moving quietly across the marble because I had always moved quietly in this house, a habit I had developed without ever asking myself why. The study door was open by 2 inches. I don't know what stopped me at that gap. Instinct, maybe. Or the particular quality of silence that surrounds a man who believes he is completely alone. His voice came first. She found nothing. And even if she had, her father made sure she'd never know who to trust with it. I made sure of that personally. The hallway tilted. My hand found the wall. The old man was getting too close to the Chicago accounts. You know that. It wasn't personal, it was arithmetic. Not personal. My father's death, the car accident on the I-87 that the police had called tragic and the coroner had called unremarkable, had been arithmetic. I did not move. I did not breathe. Through the 2-inch gap I could see Hyun's back, his hand in his pocket, his neck tattoo pulsing with every syllable that rewrote the last 3 years of my life. He was relaxed. Arrogant. A man who had already processed the cost of what he'd done and filed it neatly away. He thought I had left for the restaurant. He thought he was alone. The candles on the anniversary table burned themselves down that night. I stood in that hallway until his call ended, until his footsteps moved away from the door, until the penthouse fell into the kind of silence that exists on the other side of a detonation. And then I did something Kwon Hyun would spend the next several weeks trying to understand. I did not leave. I became a ghost. The Kwon Seo Tower penthouse was not simply an apartment. It was an architectural statement, 6,400 square feet of engineered dominance, built by a man who trusted no one and therefore built redundancies into everything. Panic rooms. Service corridors. A ventilation crawl space that ran the full length of the East Wing, designed as a security measure and used, in the years before my arrival, for purposes I was only beginning to understand. My father had toured this apartment exactly once, 6 months before the wedding. He had asked to see the building schematics, framing it as professional habit. Hyun had laughed and handed them over. 2 weeks before the staged accident on the I-87, my father had mailed me a single folded document with no note. I had filed it away without looking at it closely. I looked at it now. I moved into the East Wing crawl space with a backpack containing 3 protein bars, a water bottle, my father's document, a burner phone I had purchased in cash the previous month in a midtown pharmacy, and absolutely nothing else. From inside the walls, I watched my husband grieve. He was magnificent at it. I had not expected that. Hyun stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows in the mornings, coffee in hand, staring out over the city with an expression of such precise desolation that I almost pressed my palm against the interior wall as though I could reach him. His lead guard, Jin, a compact and watchful man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stood at a respectful distance and said the right quiet things. The household staff moved with exaggerated softness. 2 of Hune's lieutenants came and went. There were phone calls I memoized, names I filed, numbers I wrote on the inside cover of my father's document in handwriting so small I needed to squint to read it back. By day 4, I had a map of every conversation in the penthouse. By day 6, I understood what my father had died trying to expose. The ledger. A physical record of every bribed official, every laundered account, every death coded as a line item in the Chicago operation Hune ran beneath the architecture of his legitimate empire. My father had been an inch away from it. According to Hune's own phone calls, overheard through 17 inches of wall and ventilation mesh, the ledger was not digital. It was handwritten. And it was hidden inside the restoration project in Hune's private studio, a 19th-century oil painting my father had gifted us as a wedding present. My father had always been 3 moves ahead. He had simply not anticipated that the man sitting across the board was willing to flip the table entirely. I waited 11 days. Patience is a kind of violence, when you use it correctly. I had learned that from my father, who had once spent 14 months building a single diplomatic relationship for the sole purpose of dismantling it on a precise date. I had inherited his patience the way other daughters inherit jewelry, something precious, something sharp, something you only bring out when the occasion demands it. The studio was on the north end of the penthouse, accessible through a door Hune kept locked with a biometric pad. What Hune did not know, what I doubted he had ever thought to consider, was that the ventilation access panel inside the studio had not been secured from the interior. My father's schematic had noted it in small, neat print. North Studio, Panel 7C, unlatched. I came through at 2:14 in the morning. The studio smelled of linseed oil and the particular cold that gathers in rooms that are rarely entered. The painting sat on the restoration easel where I had left it months ago, a massive, dark canvas depicting a coastal storm, the surface cracked with age, the frame ornate and deliberately overwhelming. I had been restoring it as a project to occupy the hours Hune was away. He had found it charming. A wife with artistic patience, filling her days with careful work. He had not found it suspicious. I moved to the painting in the dark, my hands remembering the texture of it without needing light. The ledger was not inside the frame, that would have been too obvious, and my father was never obvious. It was adhered to the back of the original canvas, flush beneath a secondary lining I had been working toward for weeks as part of the legitimate restoration process. My last session, 3 days before the hallway, had brought me to within a centimeter of it. I worked for 40 minutes. When the lining released, the ledger fell into my hands like something exhaling. It was smaller than I expected. 40 pages. Dense columns of figures, names, dates, all in my father's handwriting, which I would have recognized in complete darkness. He had not simply been investigating Hune. He had been documenting him for years. Every entry was dated. Every entry was cross-referenced. It was not just evidence. It was architecture, built with the same patience I had inherited, designed to be unassailable. I pressed it against my chest in the dark studio and allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of grief. Then I photographed every page with the burner phone, resecured the canvas, and climbed back through panel 7C. The painting looked untouched. That was the point. Jin started checking the ventilation panels on day 13. I noticed it first as a pattern. He would move through the penthouse on a route that was slightly too thorough to be standard security. He'd pause at the east corridor longer than necessary. Once, he stood outside panel 7C for 4 minutes without moving, his hand resting on the wall at exactly the height where a person might press from the other side. Jin Taeyang was the most dangerous man in Hune's operation for precisely the reason no one talked about him. He was careful in the way that quiet people are careful. No theater, no performance. He simply watched until the picture assembled itself. I had been too still in panel 4B the morning Hune had received the news that my phone had last pinged a cell tower in New Jersey. I had exhaled too slowly, or shifted my weight by a fraction. Something, some human imprecision, had disturbed the arithmetic of the silence. Jin had been in the east corridor at that exact moment. I had watched his eyes through the ventilation mesh. They had not moved to the panel directly. But they had considered the wall. I made a decision that night, Jin could not be allowed to find me before I was ready. Not because I was afraid of him, I had moved past fear into something colder and more functional, but because Jin finding me meant Hyun finding me, and Hyun finding me before the ledger was in the right hands meant I would simply disappear. Not divorced. Not disgraced. Erased. So I gave Jin something else to look at. The first item I left was my father's cufflink. It appeared on Hyun's nightstand on a Thursday morning, the left cufflink from the pair my father had worn to our wedding, gold with a small engraved 040 say. I had carried both in my backpack since the beginning. I placed the left one in the precise center of Hyun's nightstand while he showered, slipping out of the ventilation panel that accessed the bedroom wall and back again in under 90 seconds. I watched him find it through the mesh. He went very still. Picked it up. Turned it over. Set it down. Picked it up again. He stood there for a long time. Long enough that Jin, entering the room, noticed the stillness and asked a question Hyun answered with a single dismissive word. But his hand closed around the cufflink and did not open for the rest of the morning. Good. Let it live in his hand. Let it live in his mind. The second item was a photograph, printed on the burner phone at a 24-hour pharmacy on Lexington that had a self-service kiosk and no functional cameras. It was an image of my father and me at my college graduation, small and unframed, tucked into the spine of the book Hyun kept on his desk, The Art of War, which he read without irony. I placed it there on a Sunday. He found it on a Monday. I watched the color drain from his face. The third item was the right cufflink, left on the bathroom mirror ledge, exactly where my father had set his personal effects every time he visited. A detail I had never mentioned to Hyun. A detail that meant nothing to anyone who had not been in this family. By the time I left the third item, Hyun was sleeping 3 hours a night. Jin had resumed watching the walls. And I had begun making the calls that would make the next chapter of this story irreversible. He figured it out on a Wednesday. I don't know precisely what broke the illusion, whether it was Jin's instincts finally organizing themselves into a certainty, or whether Hyun's own mind, stripped of sleep and hollowed by guilt, had simply done the math that his pride had been refusing to do. I heard it in his voice before I saw his face, a register I had never encountered in 3 years of marriage. Not cold. Not calculated. Afraid. Lock it down, he said to Jin, at 6 in the morning, standing in the center of the living room in yesterday's shout. Every room. Every corridor. I want the ventilation system checked, all of it. Pull the staff. No one in or out. Jin's response was quiet and immediate. Within the hour, the penthouse had transformed from a gilded residence into something that resembled a compression chamber. 4 additional security personnel arrived. The service elevators were disabled. The ventilation panels, every one of them, were screwed shut from the exterior with hardware I could hear being installed in real time, the drill reverberating through the walls like a countdown. I had 48 hours of supplies left. I had the ledger photographed and encrypted, distributed across 3 separate channels to 3 separate people I trusted, with instructions that would activate automatically if I did not send a specific code within 72 hours. I had my father's 2 cufflinks in my pocket. I had a route through the building's original 1960s infrastructure that predated Hyun's renovations by 60 years, a route that appeared on no schematic Hyun had ever been given, because my father had sourced the original building plans, not the renovation documents. Hyun was hunting a ghost. What he did not understand was that the ghost had already unlocked the door. I needed 48 hours. I needed him looking inward, toward the walls, while I moved outward, toward the one event that would give me a public stage and a protected exit simultaneously. The Kwon Foundation Annual Gala. 4 days away. The Mandarin Oriental Ballroom. Every newspaper in the city, every rival family, every federal observer who had been circling Hyun's empire for years, all in one room, dressed in black tie, watching. My father had always said, if you must fall, fall where everyone can see. I intended to do the opposite of falling. The dress was where I had left it. 2 months before the hallway, before the anniversary dinner that never happened, I had worn a gown to a preview event at the Met, champagne silk, structured shoulders, the kind of dress that announces a woman's arrival before she speaks. I had returned it to the garment bag in the East Wing closet, the one closet Hyun's new security detail had swept and dismissed as irrelevant. It was still there. I emerged from the original service infrastructure of the building into the basement of the Kwonseo Tower at 7:41 p.m., 4 days after Hyun had locked down the penthouse. The route had taken me through 2 sub-basements and a mechanical room that smelled of rust in the 1960s. I had emerged looking like a woman who had walked through history to get here, which, I suppose, was accurate. The gala was 12 blocks north. I arrived at 8:15 p.m. The moment I walked through the doors of the Mandarin Oriental Ballroom, I understood why my father had loved a well-timed entrance. The room did not stop. But it noticed. A woman in champagne silk with long, intricate braids and an expression of absolute composure, arriving alone at her husband's foundation gala 2 weeks after allegedly abandoning her marriage. That kind of arrival has a frequency. It travels. I watched it travel to Hyun across the ballroom in real time. He saw me from 40 feet away. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Jin, at his shoulder, turned to follow his gaze and went absolutely still, and in Jin's stillness I finally saw the thing I had suspected for weeks. He had known. He had known I was in the walls. He had chosen, for reasons I did not yet fully understand, not to tell Hyun with certainty. Only suspicion. Only perhaps. I crossed the room slowly, because everything I did now was for the audience. The federal observers, 2 of them, stationed near the bar with the specific posture of people trying not to look official, had already received their anonymous package. 40 photographed pages. My father's handwriting. A cover letter written in my own. It had arrived at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division at 3 p.m. that afternoon, delivered by a courier service I had arranged from the burner phone 4 days prior. The ledger was already in motion. I was simply here to watch the ending arrive. Hyun set his glass down. He moved toward me with the measured pace of a man who was experiencing, for the first time, the specific terror of a situation he could not control. The dragon on his neck was moving. Breathing. Alive with the panic he would never let reach his face. Amelia. His voice was low. Careful. The voice of a man buying time. Hyun. I smiled. The smile I had practiced in the dark, in the walls of his penthouse. The smile that contained 3 years of patience and 40 pages of my father's handwriting. You look exhausted. Have you been sleeping? They came in at 9:03 p.m. Not the federal agents, not yet. They came first, 4 men in evening wear who moved with the specific purpose of people who had been waiting for a signal. Representatives of the Park faction, the rival organization that had been absorbing Hyun's Chicago accounts at the edges for 2 years, quietly, methodically. Men who had received their own copy of the ledger at 3 p.m. that afternoon, because my father, meticulous to the last, had understood that federal justice moves slowly, but rival factions move immediately. I had sent it to both. I had learned from the best. Hyun saw them the moment I did. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the rapid, brilliant reorganization of threat assessment that had kept him untouchable for a decade. He reached for his phone. Jin stepped forward. And then the federal agents moved, because the 4 men in evening wear had produced credentials of their own, and the room had achieved the particular chaos of multiple authorities arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. Jin looked at me across the ballroom as it happened. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he did something I had not prepared for. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. Not absolution. A man like Jin Taeyong did not deal in absolution. Something more precise. Acknowledgement. He had known I was in the walls. He had let the ghost do her work. I would think about that nod for a long time afterward. Hyun was escorted out of the Mandarin Oriental Ballroom at 9:17 p.m., between 2 federal agents, past the photographers who had been covering the gala, past the rivals who watched with the silent satisfaction of men whose patience had finally been repaid. He did not look back. I had expected to feel something large in that moment. Triumph, perhaps. Or the specific grief of watching a man you once loved be reduced to the arithmetic of his own choices. What I felt was quieter than either of those things. It felt like a door closing on a room I had been trapped in, not with violence, not with drama, but with the soft, definitive click of a lock turning from the inside. I stayed until 9:30. I accepted a glass of champagne I didn't drink. I spoke to no one and let everyone see me. Then I walked back through the lobby, past the doorman who nodded as though this were a completely ordinary evening, and out onto the Manhattan sidewalk where the November air was cold and clarifying. I had one cufflink left. The right one. I had left the left one on Hyun's nightstand 3 weeks ago, in another life. I held the right one in my palm for a moment, the gold warm from my skin, the small engraved O catching the streetlight. I found it, Daddy. I closed my fingers around it, turned north on Madison Avenue and walked until the city swallowed me. Behind me, the Quan Foundation Gala continued without its host. Ahead of me, there was nothing scheduled, nothing arranged, nothing that belonged to anyone but me. For the first time in 3 years, that felt exactly like enough. And that is where we leave Amelia tonight. Walking into the dark. Free. Dangerous. And just getting started. If this story pulled you in, if you felt every second of that hallway, those walls, that ballroom, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button right now, because it tells me you want more of this, and I will deliver more of this. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on your notifications, because the next chapter of this world is coming, and you do not want to walk in late. This is not the kind of story you catch up on. You need to be here when it drops. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me, are you Team Amelia all the way, or did any part of you still feel something for Hune in that ballroom? Because I read every single comment. Every one. And I want to know exactly where your head is before the next video changes everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for trusting me with your time. I do not take that lightly. Stay close. The next move is already in motion. Blackheart.